Okay, good afternoon, students. Welcome back. So, before we begin our study of the famous play Othello, let us continue with our general introduction to Shakespeare. In the previous class, we got introduced to uh, William Shakespeare, the man, and the playwright. In today's we will take a closer look at some more general topics related to Shakespeare the playwright, and in the next class I will launch into the play. Okay, so to continue where we left off the other day, let me take you back to the presentation. Give me a moment. Yes, we began with the Elizabethan age. We began with an introduction to the glory and the grandeur of the English Renaissance during the Elizabethan age. We talked about the encouragement that the monarch gave in that very prosperous age to the arts and to cultural performances, which is what laid the groundwork for the emergence of a playwright like William Shakespeare. And then we went to his native village of Stratford upon Avon. We saw the important buildings and places associated with the life of William Shakespeare, his birthplace, his parents, the siblings, the farmhouse of his mother's family, the room where he was born, the kind of work that the family was engaged in, the school that he attended, the grammar school that he attended, and of course, the little town of Stratford, which even today retains a great deal of the Elizabethan times in terms of the buildings and, largely the buildings. Then we saw the Holy Trinity Church, the place that is triply connected with Shakespeare as a place where he got baptized, where he got married, and finally where he was buried to after his death. We took a look at the grave of Shakespeare in Holy Trinity Church. We talked about the act of poaching for which he would have been arrested from Charlecote Estate, because of which he ran away to the city of London and there soon gained a foothold in the theatre, in the world of theatre, and in no time at all, with the immense popularity of his plays, how he became the part owner of this massive structure called the Globe Theatre, which you can see from the inside in this image and transactionally in this image, telling us a great deal about the stage, the kind of language that would have been used to be accommodated on this kind of stage, the kind of audiences who gathered at these plays, and so on. And then we talked about how the enduring legacy of William Shakespeare in the performances in the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford and in various parts of the world, across genres. To top it all, I think I use that image of the Snow Globe Theatre in in Sweden, which comes up every winter and melts away when it is summer. Well, summer or winter, east or west, the enduring legacy of William Shakespeare continues, which is so aptly summarized in this very famous line written by his contemporary and good friend also, Ben Jonson, who was also a playwright, an eminent playwright of his time, and also a great scholar. He was not one of the university wits, but he had all the makings of a university wit, and it was he who made this very famous remark about Shakespeare, that he was not of an age but for all time. Of course, there are many more famous assessments made by Ben Jonson of William Shakespeare, as there are assessments by other great writers and critics too. But for the moment, I think we will suffice. This will suffice. He was not of an age but for all time. The proof of it, of course, is in the fact that we are sitting here centuries after William Shakespeare wrote his plays to be performed on the stage. We are sitting here far away in another part of the world, in another culture, people who belong to an entirely different civilization, sitting and studying the plays of William Shakespeare. I think that is proof enough of this the universal appeal of William Shakespeare. Yeah, so let me now, as we get introduced to the place again, let us go back to the town of Stratford. There, right in the city square, you will find this kind of a structure. This is what welcomes you to the birthplace of William Shakespeare. And in the city square, you will have this massive, it's a memorial actually, like a park where you have some very significant statue. It is known as the Gower Memorial in Stratford. And at the center, you have this statue of William Shakespeare on a pedestal. And on four sides of the statue, you have the different kinds of plays that Shakespeare wrote being represented with some typical characters. Okay, so we are now entering the topic of the different kinds of plays that William Shakespeare wrote, and you can take a guess as to what the four categories might be. On four sides of the statue, surrounding the statue on four sides, you have four different statues. They are statues of well-known Shakespearean characters who symbolize the four different kinds of plays that Shakespeare wrote. So what might these four divisions be? Then you can take a guess at the characters who might symbolize these four categories of plays. What might the four categories be? Anyone?
Comedy, tragedy.
Yes. Yeah, comedy and tragedy, definitely.
Romance.
Pardon?
Romance.
Romances. Yeah, I mean, that's a good guess. But then I think romances kind of come in the category of comedies. Shakespeare's comedies are known as the romantic comedies. They are well known as romantic comedies. So you do not have a separate category called the romances. Nayanthara is writing something. Tragedy, comedy, what is Nayanthara writing? History, yes, very good. Histories, that's a third important category. One more. That you... Pardon?
Comic tragedy.
Tragicomedy, isn't it? Tragicomedy is again something that belongs to the comedies. Shakespeare's comedies are so unique because they have, some of them have that element of dark tragedies too. So it's not that. The fourth category is philosophy.
Oh, philosophy.
Philosophy. Yeah. This is just one division. This person named Gower made this memorial, and he decided to categorize the plays as histories, comedies, tragedies, and philosophies. So next, you could take a guess at who the major characters might be, who represent these, who would be the representative of comedy, who would be the representative of tragedy, of philosophy, and of history. For history, you have
Henry.
King Henry V, known as Prince Hal, who appears in 2 or 3 plays of Shakespeare. There are many such characters who appear in many plays, and Prince Hal, or Harry, or Henry V, an eminent monarch of England, he is the one who represents histories. So that is how it is situated vis-a-vis the statue. The next would be comedies. And who do you think would be the comic star represented there. I think he is the character who appears in the most plays of Shakespeare. I mean, the most number of plays of Shakespeare. Who's that? This character named Falstaff. Falstaff again appears in many of the history plays and other comedies too. A very round, a kind of gluttonous person who talks a lot, and that is Falstaff, one of the most well-known comic characters created by Shakespeare. Among the tragic characters, we might think of the great tragic heroes that we are familiar with, like King Lear and Macbeth and Othello and Hamlet, but it is Lady Macbeth's statue that has been erected there. I think it is some kind of gender balance that they have probably ensured by using the image of Lady Macbeth. It's interesting to note that Shakespeare, as a person who belonged to his time and as a person, who, in spite of being of having created some very powerful women characters, was largely, reluctant probably to give any of his female characters a central position. We have, of course, characters like Portia in Merchant of Venice, who gets more lines in that play than the other characters in that play. She really overshadows the characters like Antonio and Bassanio, and even Shylock, the arch villain of that play. But we are excuse me, we are familiar with the fact that those days, during those days, women never enacted, they never came up on stage, and the female roles were all enacted by young men. In any case, women were never given the kind of center stage that the men were given. So you do not have any play that has the name of a woman by itself. It's always in the company of a male. Like, for example, Romeo and Juliet, Troilus and Cressida. You never have, there is not even a single play which says, Julius Caesar, King Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth. They're all male protagonists. The women are always in the company of someone. There is only one work of his in which you have a woman being mentioned by herself. Can anyone guess which work that is? Which is that work? Are there any messages in the chat? Female quota, says Nayantara Tilak. Yeah, that's right. The statue of Lady Macbeth fills the female quota. No, but which is the work which has a sole woman's name in the title? You have Romeo and Juliet, you have Antony and Cleopatra, you have Troilus and Cressida, but you have, probably you won't guess it, it is The Rape of Lucretia, one of the poems, long poems. It is not a play. In that, you have the name of Lucretia herself. But then you know what the title indicates, The Rape of Lucretia. It just means that Lucretia, it's quite obvious that she's definitely not going to be of great heroic material there. She's definitely more of a victim in that poem. There is, since we are at it, at this kind of, quizzing, let me ask you another question. Can you mention any work of Shakespeare which has the name of an animal in it? Animals are also marginalized, like women in his plays. Anyone? No one? You can think of the play, The Taming of the Shrew. The shrew actually is a kind of animal. It's like a rodent, a mouse-like animal. And the character, the female character, who was subdued at the end of the play because she was too much of an, what shall you say, a very self-willed and very arrogant kind of woman, and they believed that arrogance in a woman is to be tamed, and therefore the play is titled The Taming of the Shrew. A very not at all complimentary kind of term of address for the woman there. So that is The Taming of the Shrew. In any case, let's go back to the four categories of plays: the comedy, the histories, the comedies, the tragedies, and then you have the philosophy, which is, of course, represented by the most philosophic of Shakespeare's characters, Prince Hamlet. You have plenty of philosophical lines in the whole play. We are familiar with some of the most famous, like "to be or not to be" and so on. He keeps ruminating over life and the meaning of life and so on. Prince Hamlet. Yeah, but when you enter Shakespeare studies, it is always, one interesting point of study is the work of a critic named Edward Dowden, a 19th century critic, who in this work, Shakespeare, a critical study of his mind and art, divided the plays of Shakespeare, the entire career of Shakespeare, into four phases. He, as a person who had done a great deal of study on Shakespeare, his life, his Shakespeare's life itself, he traced the roots of Shakespeare's family, and he divided the long career of Shakespeare into four phases, in keeping with certain events in Shakespeare's own life. So in the first phase, you have something called, he calls that the in the workshop kind of phase, where Shakespeare is just getting introduced to the world of theater, and he is learning the the ropes or the tricks of the trade, and trying to make a few entries or attempts at writing plays. And some of the early plays, which are mainly comedies, some of the early history plays, and even I think one tragedy, I think Romeo and Juliet is probably one of the earlier plays. But you can see, the compared to the later plays, these are rather shallow, rather immature, and very weak when you compare them to the later plays. So that is what is called in the workshop. And then he becomes more attuned with the whole scene. He becomes more of a maestro at the trade. And then you have him making his entry into the world. In the world is that stage. And that is where you have the most famous plays of Shakespeare, the most popular at that time, probably the romantic comedies, the great comedies like Twelfth Night, As You Like It, Much Ado About Nothing. All these plays, this is what announces the launch of the great playwright, William Shakespeare. But then, by the end of that decade, by the end of the 16th century, you have a few changes coming in. And in between that, you have the theaters closing down as a result of the plague. And then Shakespeare devoting a great deal of his time to composing poetry. That's when he wrote the sonnets and so on. But he naturally came back to the stage. But when he came back to the stage, he actually suffered a great deal on the personal front, because he had, as I told you in the previous class, 3 children, and his son Hamnet, died, and it was a very tragic phase in Shakespeare's own life, which again seems to be reflected in the great tragedies that he wrote during this third phase of his life, which is why it is called Out of the Depths. Shakespeare has really plumbed the greatest depths, you can say. You can find him staring like a lost soul at this thing called life, trying to grasp the meaning of life, trying to come to terms with life and death and pain and suffering, and probably coming to the realization that man is nothing but a tiny little worm in this immense universe. It is that kind of spirit that is conveyed in the great tragedies. But when from there he then reaches a great, a more or less philosophical height. He comes to terms probably with death and suffering and all that. And in towards the end of his career in the city of London, you find him, the note of reconciliation coming into most of the plays, and that is what is called On the Heights. Where he becomes um, uh, more sublime, more settled, and more a very mature kind of playwright, and the kind of acceptance of life and everything that life brings with it in plays like Pericles, A Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, and especially The Tempest, which comes with that note of reconciliation when Shakespeare finally decides to bid goodbye to the city and go back to Stratford and be reunited with his family. So this famous division of Shakespeare's career into 4 stages by Edward Dowden is, something that you can relate to. I have just put it in the form of these slides for you to understand it better in the workshop, the time from around 1588 to 1594, the earlier plays where he was just learning his trade, and you can find the youthful attempts, and you can find that exuberance of youthful love and imagination highlighted in these plays like Love's Labour's Lost, The Comedy of Errors, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Midsummer Night's Dream. As I told you, the tragedy Romeo and Juliet was also original. Romeo and Juliet, of course, is nothing like the great tragedies of the later phase. And then some of the history plays too. Then you have the second phase, In the World, from around 1595 to 1600, where you can see the steady progress that Shakespeare makes as a playwright in art and in craft. You find the maturing of Shakespeare. You find him having a greater command over his verse, the meter, and the power of characterization. If the characters in the earlier plays were largely stereotypes or flat kind of characters, here you have characters who are, who have depth in them, who have multidimensional kind of characters. So the great characterization that is a mark of Shakespeare's plays can be seen heightened in this phase. And it is quite obvious that the knowledge of human nature and various other issues, when you look at a play like Merchant of Venice, for example, when he makes the Jew, Shylock, speak, you realize how much of a post-colonial thinker Shakespeare was at that point of time, in the powerful lines that he makes Shylock utter against racism. It's, some very powerful lines in that work. The Merchant of Venice, Henry IV, Henry V, Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, the great romantic comedies. And it is in these plays that you have him, bringing some very powerful women characters on the stage. Rosalind, Portia in The Merchant of Venice. These are some of the most brilliant, some of the most colorful, some of the most intelligent women, who really outshine the men in these plays. The women are the ones who stand out. But then you have the third phase coming in, the tragic phase, Out of the Depths, from about 1601 to 1608. I think he lost his son in the year 1604 or so. This is, the tragedies which are so imaginative, so powerfully packed with beautiful lines of imaginative poetry. That's why they are called the romantic tragedies. It's not that they have anything romantic about them in the other sense, but very fine lines of great and intense poetry, and therefore romantic tragedies, which go right into the depth of life and probe the dark corners of man's life. And you have the themes of man's insignificance, man's helplessness against the great universe or the destiny. All of these highlighted in these plays, and themes like the pangs of despised love, the oppressor's wrong, the law, delay of law, the insolence of office, all of these come in very powerful. Here is a playwright who definitely belongs to that world and who knew everything, about the people, about the customs, about the traditions, about the ideology of those times. All of these beautifully brought out in plays like Julius Caesar, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, and then the dark tragedies like Timon of Athens, Measure for Measure, of course. It's a very good example of, sometimes it's called a problem play, sometimes it can be considered as a perfect example of a tragic comedy. It is a comedy because it has a happy ending, but then throughout you have scenes of darkness and great problems at the center. So these are the plays of the third phase. And then you have, and that will be the phase that we deal with as we discuss Othello. On the Heights, 1609 to 1612, which was when he went back to Stratford, and where you find the concluding period of Shakespeare's life. He has crossed the stormy seas and settles down on the placid waters. You find the note of peace, acceptance, tranquility, and a general maturity being reflected in the plays, as seen in works like Pericles, Cymbeline, A Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. So this is about the fourfold division of Shakespeare's plays, his career. But it is interesting to note that the first folio of Shakespeare's works, which was published in 1623, this is considered to be one of the most famous publications of all time, not just of Shakespeare's plays, but among any publication, one of the most famous publications. It is as significant as, the Bible, the publication of the Bible, the publication of the King James version of the Bible. That's a big thing in English literature. Similarly, this first folio, it's called the first folio. A folio is nothing but, a book that is made by folding the manuscript or the paper just once. The paper just once. You have the sheet of paper on which the play is written, and then it is made into a book with just one fold. That is what is called a folio. The next kind of publication would be the quarto. The quarto means it is folded once like this and then once more. So that would be that kind of publication, which would be smaller. That is what is known as a quarto. A folio edition is one in which the printed paper is just folded once when it is made into a book. And the 1623 publication, there were about 800 or so of this that came out, and they are very, very prized possessions. There is a copy kept in the British Museum. There is one in the Shakespeare birthplace. We do not have too many of these. So this was brought out in 1623 by the editors John Hemmings and Henry, I'm sorry for the spelling error, Henry Condell. And you have the cover portrait by Martin Droshout. This is one of the very few images that we have of, or portraits that we have of Shakespeare. And in this, when the first folio came out, it was in this first folio that, The Tempest was the play that was entered at the very beginning, the last play of Shakespeare. But his plays have been divided only into three categories in the folios: comedies, histories, and tragedies. Okay, so that's, I think, enough about some background information to Shakespeare. And now, as we make our entry into Shakespearean tragedy, which we will be studying with the help of Othello, it is only important that we begin by understanding the basic difference between a Shakespearean comedy and a Shakespearean tragedy. I mean, it's not just the fact that one has a happy ending and the other has a sad ending. That's not it. There are some very specific other differences too in a Shakespearean comedy, which ends in sometimes marriage, sometimes reunion, whereas the tragedy, of course, ends in the death, not only of the central character, but of many others. That is what sets a Shakespearean tragedy makes it different from other tragedies, which we will be discussing in the next slide. Then the obvious differences are like the comedies have a happy ending, the tragedies have sad endings. But yeah, the comedies, they tend to focus more on the situations. You have a lot of situations being foregrounded there, whereas in the tragedies, it is the characters. The characters are the ones. Think of a play like um, The Merchant of Venice, for example. Of course, Portia is there, a brilliant character, so also Shylock. But The Merchant of Venice, the title itself refers actually to neither of these two. It refers to Antonio. He is a merchant of Venice, and he is actually a very colorless character. Everyone loves him, everyone respects him a great deal, but the play itself does not show him as a great hero. It just presents him as a very noble man who was loved and respected by all. That's all. So it is more than the characters, the situations, like, for example, Shylock demanding the pound of flesh, and then the circumstances under which Antonio would have to part with the pound of flesh, and then Portia getting into the disguise. Oh, it's the events or the situations that are of greater importance in the comedies, whereas the tragedies are more important for the characters more than the situations. Yeah, and the characters in tragedies are, of course, as it is with Greek tragedy, men of great eminence belonging to who occupy very important positions of great power. Sometimes wealth, but always great power. They're all noble men. Whereas the comedies, would have sometimes characters who belong to lower and middle classes also. They need not always be aristocrats. And the elements that characterize the Shakespearean comedy, the theme of love, marriage, you always have very complex plots in them, mistaken identities. I know that's one of the staples of Shakespearean comedies. Misconceptions, people having all kinds of misconceptions about each other, and a lot of punning. Pun is nothing but a word play. A great deal of the comic effect is produced by these very brilliant punning or wordplay that Shakespeare engages in. Sometimes there are critics who believe that he's actually overdone it. Too much of quibbling and word puns, and it somehow takes away from the spirit of the play. And that's what some critics have highlighted about his plays. In any case, in the tragedies, you have the tragic heroes looming large over everyone, and the dichotomy or the binary between good and evil is very well brought out. The tragic flaw is very conspicuous in the tragic heroes. You have revenge as a major element in these plays, but the revenge is never all blood and full of gory details. That is what sets Shakespeare's tragedies as above the tragedies of some of his contemporaries, which were actually revenge tragedies in the real sense, with a lot of bloodshed and a great deal of gory details. Over and above the revenge and the killing and the brutality, in Shakespeare's plays, tragedies, that philosophy stands out, that ideology, that what shall you say, the character of the tragic hero. That is something that makes you take note, or you take note of that much more than the bloodshed and all that. So, and then the supernatural, the element of the supernatural, the presence of the supernatural is something that was very Shakespearean. Shakespeare delighted in bringing the supernatural, as a ghost. There are most of his tragedies, in fact, Macbeth, Hamlet, all of them have the arrival of the ghost. The ghost plays a very important character in many of the plays. In fact, it is said that Shakespeare himself probably enacted the role of the ghost whenever Hamlet was presented during his own lifetime. And then the cathartic effect. So that's the difference between Shakespearean comedy and tragedy. But I think we need to look at the tragic element and the tragedies by themselves and see how these tragedies are different from the Greek tragedies, the ancient. We are familiar with Aristotle having said so much about the tragedy. Whatever he said about the tragedy was based on the plays of great Greek playwrights like Sophocles. Those were great, but Shakespeare's plays seem to be of a different mold altogether. And we need to know how Shakespeare wrote tragedies which were very different from the tragedies written till then. A good beginning point would be this kind of structure, a look at the structure of a Shakespearean play, to do which we can go to the pyramid, the image or the figure drawn by the German playwright Gustav Freytag. He was talking about plays in general, but he specifically referred to Shakespeare's plays too. And you find most of the, the plays of Shakespeare, the great tragedies, are written in this pyramidal structure where you have an introduction called the exposition, most probably conveyed during the first act of the play. And then there comes a turning point, something that incites some further action, after which the action rises. So you have the rising action in the second act. It gets complicated until it reaches the climax, which would most probably be in the third act. And then you have a reversal of fortune, the falling action. There comes a point of time when you have this problem getting resolved, and then the final resolution or the denouement. That this is the typical structure. Of course, the length of each one of these might vary. For example, in a play like Julius Caesar, for example, the climax comes very early. Julius Caesar is murdered early in the play, and then you have, whereas in some others it might be at a slightly later point of time, as it is, for example, in Othello. It's slightly later, towards the end, that you have the climax. So this, however, is what every Shakespearean play contains, this kind of pyramidal structure. The shape of the pyramid may alter here and there with each play, but by and large, these are the components of the Shakespearean tragedy. And I think we can spend just a few minutes thinking about the origin of tragedy in ancient Greece. I'll stop in 5 minutes. Tragedy, we are familiar with. So the word is so commonly used, but actually, when you talk about tragic plays or plays with tragedy in the context of drama, actually we go back to Greece. This is where the word has its origin, and quite surprisingly, it probably meant in ancient Greece goat songs. Okay, tragos was the word for goat, and it is probably from that word, goat, and ode. Aiden was to sing, and from that you get ode, a song, and tragos plus ode becomes tragedy. Probably because when these kind of sad plays, when the serious plays were performed, as prize, they would get goats, or probably sometimes the performers would wear goat skins, and it is also possible that goats were given as sacrificial animals. They were sacrificed during the course of the ritual, from which tragedy developed. So these are the conjectures that critics make about the origin of tragedy. The ancient Greek world, in which you have the great plays of Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and so on, you would have the very few actors, maybe just 2 or 3 actors. You would have the chorus, somebody who would be like a commentator, and then the chorus was actually the first character on the Greek stage. And then you would have other characters coming in. The conversation between the chorus and the other characters later developed into full-fledged plays. And you're familiar with the ancient Greek theater, which would, you have the amphitheater. In the center, you have the circular stage, and that is where you have these people, the chorus and the other 2 or 3 actors performing. and to be seen from afar. The gallery seats would be far away in the amphitheater. They would highlight, the tragic expression on the face with the use of these huge masks. So from beginning till end, the actors would have this fixed expression as seen on the mask. They would be distinguished from the characters in comedies. Comedy would be, the other kind of plays, with particularly by the use of this mask. In the comedies, they would have a happy expression, and also the shoes. These were the buskins which were used by the men who belonged to the aristocratic classes, and tragedies always dealt with their life. Whereas the others would be the lower class categories, and they would wear something called the thin shoes called the buskin. And I'm sorry, the sock, SOCK, socks. This is the buskin, and the other one is a. So this is how they would distinguish between a comedy and a tragedy. We need not linger too much in Greece, or Greek tragedy. We talked about this is about the chorus and the performance, the dialogue with the other actors and so on in Athenian drama. But in English drama, I told you the other day about the early religious origin of English drama. Under the influence of the ancient Greek plays in England, in the church was where drama had its origin. And you would have the religious themed plays being performed on the occasion of Christmas and Easter and so on. Plays would be either based on the Bible. The biblical plays were known as the mystery plays. Sometimes they would have the lives of saints dramatized. They were known as the miracle plays. Sometimes you had very strong didactic plays, plays which sought to teach the people. They had great allegorical content, and they were known as the morality plays. And in between these heavy moralistic plays, sometimes you would have light scenes of comedy interspersed. These were known as the interludes. So all in all, these were the kind of plays that were performed inside the church on the occasion of Christmas and Easter. And then they became so popular that very soon they had to take the plays outside the church in order to accommodate the crowds. And then I told you about how they developed as the cycle plays. You can see the moving stages being taken to different parts of the country. And even today, you have the York cycle of plays, the Chester cycle of plays, and so on, which are observed. And each scene, they would have each moving stage would enact one particular scene. And then it would move to the next town. The next wagon would come to this town. And so each episode would be handed over to a particular guild. The guild of, a guild is nothing but a group of professionals. The guild of carpenters, let's say, the guild of merchants, the guild of horsemen, the guild of fishermen, and so on. So each, depending on the theme, each trade guild would be given charge of these cycle plays. Now, with that, what happens is that the plays get more and more secularized. The religious content gradually gets eroded, and it gets more and more secular. And that is what laid the groundwork for the development of the first English tragedy in the year 1561, Gorboduc, by Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton. It is also known as Ferrex and Porrex. That is the other title of this play. And then we can jump straight to the Elizabethan age, where you have the university wits, about whom we discussed the other day, the major university wits: Thomas Kyd, John Lilly, George Peele, Robert Greene, Thomas Lodge, Thomas Nash, and of course, the most famous among them, Christopher Marlowe, whose plays like Tamerlane, Dr. Faustus, The Jew of Malta, and Edward II were the great tragedies that were popular till the arrival of Shakespeare on the stage. And I think in the next class, we can probably begin with this point about the difference between Shakespearean plays or tragedies and the Greek tragedies. Greek tragedies, tragedies of fate, where more than the character, it is already ordained that this would happen to the characters. The fate is so powerful in Greek tragedy. Whereas in Shakespeare's plays, fate does not play such a major role. It is mainly because of their characters that tragedy befalls them. While the chorus has a very powerful position in Greek drama, in Shakespearean drama, you do not have the chorus, but the supernatural, which was not there in Greek drama, plays a significant role in Shakespearean drama. While Greek drama would only have minimal characters and it would always be just one plot, Shakespeare's plays are so rich. There is, of course, a central plot, but there are subplots which help us to relate to the main plot in a better way. It's a kind of alter ego kind of character that you might have in the subplot. And then numerous characters, each one drawn so well. While the Greek, plays were very much concerned about adhering to the three unities, Shakespeare took a lot of liberty and he never bothered about the three unities, unity of time, place, and action. And he also went ahead and brought in comic relief, much to the anger of some of the harsh critics of his time and later times. Shakespeare had no problem in merging the boundaries between tragedy and comedy. And you have in between heavy scenes of comedy, scenes that provide a lot of comic relief. So all in all, these are the things that make Shakespeare's characters and plays so rich and so unique. And we will discover all this with our introduction to Othello. And in the meantime, I would also like to, I think we'll wind up for the day. It's 50 minutes. I've taken exactly 50 minutes. I do not want to prolong it further. Okay, just 31 students have joined. Vaishnavi, what is the reason?
മിസ് കുറേ പേർക്ക് മിസ് മഴയുടെ കാരണം നെറ്റ് ഇഷ്യൂസ് ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പം അതാണ്.
Okay, ശരി. I'll see you tomorrow. I think I have an hour with you. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.